let's go straight into the conversation this morning. I know that it's been like a back and forth where we even talk about the report from the EU as it concerns the just concluded 2023 general elections. A party like the People's Democratic Party, for instance, and the Labour Party are cashing out on this particular information from the EU. Obviously, we know that that's because they are at the tribunal as we speak. But then again, the federal government has kicked against this and has outrightly rejected this particular report. But we want to get your perspective on this particular issue. Let's hear you.
Well, I fundamentally disagree with the idea that it's the government's place to disagree with the reports for the simple fact that the argument the government has put out, people like Festus Keyama put out, is that somehow it's not the EU's place to even offer any kind of judgment on the Nigerian elections. Well, it just so happened that the said EU also happened to have, you know, partially, sponsored INEC the process of carrying out those elections. So if I spend money on something, I'm very much entitled to review the results of what my investment is. So this money that I gave you, and you guaranteed that X, Y, Z was going to be done with this money, you haven't done it. So I have every right to review it and to publicly state that you haven't lived up to your end of the bargain. So that's for starters. Now, regarding the report itself, I think it to me, to my mind, because I've actually gone through the report, I'm actually looking at it right now. In fact, even though it did it, it did a good job of basically documenting what we already knew clearly, sort of codifying it into a document that you can actually refer to, a legal standard document. I think it didn't even go far enough. I feel as if maybe the goal was to err on the side of caution a bit, because there were, apart from the issues that were mentioned, the fact that the conduct of the elections itself left a lot to be desired. The elections themselves were heavily flawed. The results that were announced were extremely questionable. INEC cannot explain how it came about those results. The announcement that was made at a time when there was actually no evidence that the supposed winner actually won the election, and basically just pulled it out of thin air. Other things that were not mentioned were, for example, the fact that the pre-vote vetting process by which candidates were even allowed to even be on the ballot. There was no vetting process, which is how now we have this weird situation where both opposition parties are in court trying to prove basically that the person who was eventually declared as winner of the election shouldn't even have been on the ballot in the first place. Meanwhile, people like myself had already done work as far back as July last year, showing that this person actually shouldn't be on the ballot. But for whatever reason, the Nigerian, the entire, what's the word I'm looking for? The mechanism by which such vetting was to be made apparently didn't even exist. So whether that was with regard to INEC, whether that was with regard to the court system, because I remember in November, a lawsuit was actually commenced in I think the High Court of Abuja, trying to challenge the candidacy of the person that was eventually declared the winner. That this person committed several perjuries on his INEC EC9 declaration, so it shouldn't be on the ballot. And what the court did was basically run away from
now even when we lean on some of the the issues that you had raised earlier for not even allowing President Bola Ahmed Tinubu to be on the ballot. I know that some of those cases are in court as we speak, so we'll leave that to the court to decide. But then again, I want to bring your attention to something that Adamu Garba actually wrote concerning this issue. Of course, we know Adamu Garba is former APC presidential aspirant and also a staunch member of the APC. He now said, I'm just going to take a snippet of a particular paragraph that he wrote. It's actually a very lengthy one, but he says the colonialist racist mindset of the Western nation would not let them imagine Africans to have a decisive, courageous, and bold leadership capable of remarkable transformations such as President Tinubu. So for him, that's the reason why the EU is coming up with this kinds of report concerning the presidential elections.
Well, I mean, with all due respect, if if there are 100 people left in Nigeria and Garba Shehu is one of those 100 people and he offers an opinion, then that means that there are 99 opinions worth listening to. So, with all due respect, his opinion doesn't isn't really something that I put much stock
So,
in.
so for you, you feel that the EU, there's no bias underneath the tone of that particular report.
Well, as I said, the EU partially sponsored the election. The EU gave billions of dollars to INEC, sorry, millions of euros to INEC. So, for the fact that they had a stake in this thing, it's actually even ridiculous for you to now start saying that, oh, it's some neo-colonial, no, it's their money that you used. And if you know that you are so independent and you are so, you are so opposed to their alleged neo-colonialism, then you shouldn't have accepted their money. Why couldn't Nigeria fund its own election if you're such an African hero? The truth is that the EU spent its money on this thing, so they are very much entitled to say that, look, this is what these are the expectations that we had. These are the guarantees that you gave us. You came to Chatham House, you made categorical statements. You went into your media, you made categorical statements. You said there will be this, there will be that in place. And on the day, this thing simply did not happen. So they are entitled to call it out, right? So they are not even, and to be honest, it's just a report, right? On its own, it doesn't change anything. The report isn't something that can be used to punish anybody. It's just a report, right? It's what the Nigerian government chooses to do or what the court system chooses to do with that report that makes it valuable or not. So the fact that these characters are getting so hot around the collar because a report was published, I think that in itself is a very strong self-indictment. It shows that there's the an innocent conscience fears no accusation. Let me
Exactly.
just put it out.
Okay, because just on the heel of what you're saying, I think something stood out for me with regards to the response of the presidency to this particular report. They said, we strongly reject in its entirety any notion and idea from any organization, group, and individual remotely suggesting that the 2023 election was fraudulent. Now, when you say that you reject in its entirety the report that was given by the EU, now the EU also listed 6 priority areas that needs to be looked into. Like you said, these were realities that Nigerians experienced during the elections. How then is a computed report wrong in its entirety? Now, some of the priority areas was the fact that we need to remove ambiguity from our laws, and we need to establish a publicly accountable selection process for INEC members. These are things that Nigerians have continued to clamor for since the February 25 election. And like you would say, the likes of yourself, you put in work prior to these elections that should have given us, a different perspective to the election generally. But with regards to these key areas, what are your thoughts when you juxtapose it with, the presidency saying, no, we can't take this, versus the 6 areas that have been highlighted by the EU?
Well, I guess it just goes to show that the administration, which has come into power after being declared winner of the election, has no interest in any sort of honest or sincere evaluation of the electoral process, which, in my opinion, is because the administration is very well aware, more aware than any of us, in fact, that the election that brought it into office was fraudulent. So obviously, if I'm the beneficiary of fraud, I'm not going to agree with the policeman who is calling out and investigating the fraud. Or this is not even a policeman. This is just an independent international body making a statement, right? And on its own, that statement doesn't wield any power. It doesn't have any implications on its own. So just for the fact that I'm so diametrically opposed to what is a statement of the fact that Nigeria's elections were not well conducted, that the Nigerian people have not been, that the results of the elections do not make sense to the Nigerian people because the voting reality on ground doesn't tally with what was announced, and INEC cannot explain the disparity between the two. And that there are so many other ancillary processes surrounding the election that simply didn't happen the way they were supposed to happen. So if I'm the beneficiary of all the things that have gone wrong, then yes, obviously I'll be fiercely opposed to this report because, and I would also recommend that anyone who hasn't actually read this report should actually download the report. It's freely available on the Eves platform, so that you don't just go by the news reports talking about the report, which is something we do a lot in Nigeria. People should actually download the report and read it. It takes a while, but within an hour or two, you will get through it. It's a very, very detailed report, which I think, as I said, the value of this report doesn't lie so much in how far it goes, but just for the fact that within all the stuff we're already familiar with, it does a very good job of documenting it at a standard that can be taken to anywhere in this world. So you can carry this document and present it in court. It was presented in court yesterday, funny
Yeah.
enough. And that's where the value of this report lies. So just to recap everything I've said, this report on its own doesn't change anything. On its own, it doesn't wield any power. And the fact that if the government has reacted so vehemently toward it, to me, is it's a dead giveaway. It's a very clear sign that there's a saying that the a I forget the exact saying, but something to the effect of an old woman who has brittle bones. When she sees someone cracking a chicken bone, she starts to shiver. Right. So that's pretty much the scenario that we're seeing here. The guilty conscience
Okay,
is what
so
is
I
what
think
is
I would like to differ a bit, David. I would like to differ a bit from, you saying that it doesn't have any powers to do anything. I'm talking about the report now from the EU. When you say it doesn't change anything or it doesn't have any power to do anything, then we'll begin to ask questions as how will that affect the Presidential Election Tribunal? Because whatever this report, we know that it was also presented in court yesterday. Whatever this report holds has a huge impact on how the outcome of the Presidential Petition Tribunal will turn out. Now, let's not also forget, we've seen AP's, rather PDP now, and Labour Party, cashing a lot on this particular report. So it might also
yes,
be a
but
tool.
yes, but that ultimately still leaves it up to the court to do something with the report. What I mean when I say the report on its own doesn't have any power is that it doesn't have executive power on its own. So it's not as if now that the report has been released, that it's been presented to some international body that is going to sanction Nigeria as a result.
Okay,
No,
it's not
there's
attracting
no
any
such
forms of
mechanism in
sanctions.
place. It's still up to the Nigerian court system to now decide that, okay, based on what is written in this report, um, we will therefore rule that X or Y. But ultimately, it's still Nigeria that has to determine within itself whether or not it's going to use this report to do something.
Of course, on the heels of a lot of reactions coming, we've even had a lot of Nigerians react to the presidency's reaction to the report. But then we have the likes of, Festus Kiyamo, just on the heel of some of the things you've said also, saying that this report on its own does not have the weight to legitimize Bola Ahmed Tinubu's winning or being announced as the winner of the election. Of course, it pokes a lot of holes in the process of the election. But like, Janice just asked, when we look at this report, look at, the announcement of INEC, how does this reflect on the image of the president right now as we speak?
It definitely reflects very, very poorly on him, and it's pretty much more of the same because ever since there was, even before the election itself proper, the entire posturing of that political campaign, which is now, supposedly an administration, has been that there has never really been any plan to actually win over the majority of the Nigerian people and to govern as a national government. It's always been there's been this huge sense of entitlement surrounding one man and this cult of personality. So this report is just, it only serves to further um, uh, emphasize the point that this is not a government or an administration that is representative of the popular will of Nigerians, right? The popular will of Nigerians that was expressed on February 25 has almost nothing to do with what was announced by INEC and what we are now witnessing as an administration in Nigeria. Now, as to whether, as you put it, that will delegitimize Tinubu, the unfortunate thing, which we've come to understand since February 25, is that ultimately, whenever issues like this happen, the so-called international community, the global institutions, supranational institutions, really only have as much power as the country decides. Because essentially, what we've come to understand is national sovereignty really counts for a lot. So it doesn't matter how brazen, it doesn't matter how obvious, it doesn't matter how terribly flawed an electoral process is, as long as the institutions of that country are willing to go along with it, there's actually very little that the outside world can do. So even if he is quote unquote delegitimized, it's not as if anybody can roll into Abuja and say, okay, you have to leave. No, as long as the Nigerian state is happy for the situation to continue, it will continue. Which is why I said ultimately it's up to the courts, the judicial system, to decide that is this how we want to be remembered in the eyes of the world, or are we willing to do something different that probably hasn't been done in history before, and ultimately only they can make that decision.
We must also agree that that stance is also good for the sovereignty of every nation, because underlying permutations by the presidency and even some other quarters would say, for one, the Nigeria is not even a member state under the European Union. So we'll now be saying, we've seen the likes of other nations, for instance, the Russia-Ukraine war. We are saying their presence in Africa is, a move for them to take a hold. So, and we also have conversations in Nigeria where we say, oh, with these kinds of reports, is, the EU trying to foster their presence on the Nigerian government. So I think it's also good, as you've clearly stated, that this does not hold as much effect except as interpreted by the law courts. But this is something else that is coming out from this report. The presidency faulted the data gathering technique as employed by the EU EOM. Now, one of the the lines that they said is the fact that the level of personnel the EU EOM deployed could not have been able
to cover,
to cover, all of the 36 states of the Federation and give them a qualitative report and give them the impetus to come up with this kind of, final analysis of the 25 February elections. What are your thoughts with regards to the work done versus the reports given?
So first of all, I think that's a nonsensical criticism. And if there's one criticism you cannot level at the EU AOM, is that they weren't thorough, or they didn't, in the process of gathering data, that there was no geographical spread. I think that's absolute nonsense. Um, the EU is a very well-funded organization. The mission in Nigeria, which carried out this research. First of all, I should specify that when such report developed, it doesn't mean that some white guy from Belgium came to Nigeria and then with his team started traveling around the country. That's not how it works. They already have established assets on ground in every single state of the Federation that can gather data for them. And these people are even Nigerians for the most part. So when the data is gathered to put together this report, you can be sure that there is a very high level of information fidelity, of the accurate data. These are very basic things, in the process of putting such reports together. This is an academic level report, right? So these are data gathering techniques you learn in first or second year at university. So that cannot be something that a government will seriously use as an accusation against the EU Right? They didn't have geographical spread and gathering their data. That's absolute nonsense. And I think this is one of yet another instance of a government, a Nigerian government over the past 8 years and beyond, insulting our intelligence. Right? And I think this needs to be called out because this is the equivalent of saying that um, I don't know. Let me think of it properly, like
Okay,
in
so
the US.
while we are thinking, I know that the electoral body now, that is INEC, has been involved in some kind of review of the general elections
Yeah.
recently. I think a couple of days ago. But does it worry you that it's just the federal government that is coming out to debunk what the EU has done, and we've not even heard a single word from the electoral umpire?
So I think that goes to the core of the dysfunction with INEC. What is wrong with INEC? In my opinion, what is wrong with INEC is that even though it has the word independent in its name, it's not independent at all. It exists uh, entirely within the federal civil service structure, and the head is nominated by the president. So basically, it's not independent. So if the federal government is speaking, the federal government has basically spoken for INEC.
Spoken on
We're
behalf of
seeing
INEC.
evidence of this. Yeah, we're seeing evidence of this in the ongoing tribunals where so the INEC and the APC are listed as defendants. And then you have basically they're both in courts, right? Even though they're both answering the same case, the things that they are accused of are different, but they are basically in court speaking for each other. So the APC lawyer, sometimes you can't distinguish between the APC lawyer and the INEC lawyer, and that shouldn't be, right? INEC is supposed to be an independent government institution, an independent institution of state. The APC is supposed to be a political party. But unfortunately, there is very little separation between the two. And I think it's also fair to point out that this didn't start with APC. I think as far back as 1999, we've been having issues like this where the government in power in Abuja doesn't understand the concept of separation of powers and doesn't believe that even though INEC has to be independent in its name, that in practice it should be independent in any way, right? It's not just the INEC chairman who is nominated by the government. At every level, the states, what's it called, resident electoral commissioners, these people are all, 9 times out of 10 nominated by one senator or one governor. You know, everything at every level, the process is politicized. So when you then have a government coming out to vehemently attack this report, and then INEC itself it's not saying anything. They just put out one weak statement saying that the result of the election was it's tallied with the blah blah blah. It's a very weak statement that it comes like an insult to the intelligence of people listening to it. It just shows you that INEC doesn't see itself as a separate institution from the ruling party that is in power at the center. And I think if in future there's another electoral amendment act, because I think the electoral amendment act of 2022 didn't go far enough. If there's another electoral amendment act in the years ahead, I think this is something that needs to be addressed. The independence of INEC needs to be properly enshrined in law, the way that hasn't been done so far.
Okay.
We really hope to see that happen. But another question I would like to ask before Uyai goes ahead. If I know that you were one person that was strongly against the candidacy of Bola Ahmed Tinubu, but if you were on another side or on the side of Bola Ahmed Tinubu, will you have a different opinion about the EU report?
Well, at the end of the day, we all have eyes and ears. We all saw what happened on February 25 and on March 18, right? So even if one has some certain political sympathies or partisan leanings, when you saw, okay, so for example, people from a particular ethnic group being threatened that they dare not come out and vote or else. And those people, like, it was clear who they were expected to vote for and why those pronouncements were being made. And people actually died. This wasn't just, where, and an entire geopolitical region, a very, very um, systematic effort was made to disenfranchise an entire region. For weeks preceding the election, you were seeing stories of thousands of PVCs showing up in forests, inside gutters, and buried, and all sorts of nonsense like that. And it was only happening in one specific geographical area of the country. It was clear that there was all sorts of chicanery going on to disenfranchise certain people, to basically rig the election even before the actual ballot. So even if I was on the side of party that was actually carrying out this, I think just basic. I'm not even talking about conscience or shame or morality. I don't think those things necessarily have any place in discussions like this. But I think just basic respect for data and numbers should tell you that before you come out and disagree with a report like this, you better have a rebuttal that is based on data, that is based on numbers, not
Facts.
just
True.
they're just coming out and releasing a statement. And so someone has released how many pages is this report? This report is 94 pages long. Someone has released a 94-page report with numbers, with statistics, with data, really detailed report, and then your entire response to that is a lie. It's not true. I'm sorry, that's not good enough.
Okay. I think we should be seeing a stronger rebuttal
Yeah,
to
with
the
numbers and
allegations. Yeah.
data, really true. Okay. And we're also seeing the fact that, of course, the presidency, like you said, their explanation for refusing this report is really baseless, is if we would say the least. But they're saying that you cannot fault an entire election with less than 1,000 skirmishes across 176,000 polling units. You can't come out and say that issues that we had in about 1,000, polling units will fault the entire election. Let's not even forget the reality of some of the conversations that you have brought up. What is this? NCO Luomo's words against some ethnic group, and the reality was that the very next day that the elections held, these things played out just as they said. But then we're also seeing the fact that they said the EU does not have substantial evidence. Like you said, 94 pages, well detailed, but you're saying we lack substantial evidence. But my problem with all of this is there's conversation that this has been the best played elections in the history of Nigeria since 1999. David Hundeyin, what are your thoughts about this? Because if Nigerians feel the elections were highly flawed and the people in power are saying this is the best job we've ever done, where will we find the agreeing points?
And I think that goes to the heart of the basic disconnect between the leadership or the rulership class in Nigeria and the people who are actually being led. There is a very basic divergence, very basic disconnect. We are seeing black, and some other people are determined to see it as pink. And historically, whenever you have situations like this, it's a very dangerous set of circumstances, because where you have one set of people who are being deliberately and willfully dishonest and disingenuous, they are determined to pretend that 2 plus 2 is 59. And then you have another group of people who are in the vast majority who have no choice but to see 2 plus 2 as 4. Ultimately, when the situation comes to a head, both groups are going to end up in a direct head-on conflict, and it doesn't end well. When so if I think we can draw the line all the way back to 2015, because I think that is when this particular style of politicking or governance came into fashion in Nigeria. That style of politics and governance where your intelligence is habitually insulted, right? Where a government came into power and the first thing they did was start making very, very wild accusations. They accused a previous cabinet minister of stealing 90 billion pounds, which is about 4 years worth of Nigeria's entire total annual budget. Something that is mathematically impossible, but such directives were allowed to fly. I think that's when this basic disrespect for the intelligence of Nigerians became institutionalized within the government. And what we're saying is just a continuum of that. Now, what one would hope for is that I don't know who it is, whether it's the judiciary or it's the security forces or it's someone in the ruling administration, but somebody is going to stand up in one of those meetings that you and I are not part of, in those closed rooms you and I cannot get into. When such decisions are being made that, okay, let's go out and let's insult the intelligence of these Nigerians again, that someone will stand up in those meetings and say, can we think of another way of handling this? Can we do things a different way? Because eventually, what is going to happen is that the majority of the Nigerian electorate and the Nigerian people, when they feel as if their interests are not taken into cognizance and they are not respected by their governance, by their government and by their political class, um, to put it in very sort of couched, very delicate terms, they might end up rejecting the entire political system as we know it. And when that happens, then you have a big problem on your hands because that could take the form of an out and out insurrection. That could take the form of civil disobedience. We saw a little preview of this in 2020. That could take so many formats that might not even end well for even you and I who are talking about it. So if the Nigerian political establishment doesn't want to ultimately see some sort of Arab Spring eventuality coming to play in Nigeria, which I don't think we also want to see, because in a country as volatile as Nigeria, nobody can predict how it will end.
True.
I don't think anybody wants to see an unplanned revolution in Nigeria. So if the political establishment in Nigeria doesn't want to see, such an occurrence in Nigeria, it needs to find a new way of dealing with issues like this. That insulting the intelligence of Nigerians and saying that 2 + 2 is 9 just isn't good enough. It's not going to cut it anymore. The people you are dealing with, they now have access to information at the same level that somebody living in Norway has. They exchange information at the same speed somebody in New York does. So you can no longer lie to these people and insult their intelligence with impunity. It's going to have a blowback sooner than later. So hopefully there's an adult in the room who is listening, who is going to stand up in one of those rooms one day and say, guys, please, let's try something.
To do better.
Hopefully.
Okay, so let's look at the response of opposition parties to the presidency's response. We've had Alhaji Atiku Abubakar, the presidential candidate of the People's Democratic Party, come out to say that there is no way this would have been the response of the presidency to this particular report, especially the fact that, you cannot say that the people who part-funded your election do not have a say in the results thereon. And also we saw the Labour Party also saying that this is a face-saving scheme by the presidency. Now let's look at even the roles of opposition in governance and their response to this particular rebuttal by the presidency. Do you think that this is going to put us on a path to recovery, something that President Bola Tinubu has been saying since he came into office?
Sorry, last 3 or 4 seconds were kind of awful, so could you just repeat them?
Okay. So we are looking at the responses to
opposition. Just last
so I'm saying that, do you think that these responses by the opposition is going to put us on a path to healing at all with regards to these February 25 elections?
No, I don't, because I think the only thing that will lead to healing, as you put it, is if the Nigerian court system, via the appeal court and the Supreme Court, act on this report. I think the opposition parties can just put out statements and people might agree with the statements, but ultimately that doesn't do anything on its own. Maybe it gives some level of emotional catharsis, but on its own, that's not a useful thing. I think the courts, the judiciary, has to stand up.
Do you think our courts will want to stand up in response to this report? Is it something you think our judicial system is capable of doing at a time like this?
We're about to find out. Going by historical precedents, historical precedents, the answer will be no. However, these are also unprecedented times. And we have already seen some very unprecedented things happening. We've seen a candidate go from being a total joke punchline, he's not going to get 100,000 votes, he's not going to win a single local government area, to, even according to the official results that most of us disagree with, scoring 6 million votes in the space of just 9 months. So already this is a very unprecedented situation. Nigeria has never been in this sort of situation politically before. It has never happened, both in democracy and outside democracy. We're in completely uncharted territory. So we simply don't know whether the courts are also going to do something unprecedented. I hope they do. So at this point, we're all sitting and waiting and watching with bated breath. It's up to them now to tell us that, okay, are we capable of doing something that you've never seen before? Or no matter what, are we always going to be that thing that you've always known since you were a child? So we wait and see.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of Nigerians are waiting to see, but again, it depends on the side of where the pendulum is swinging to. Both ends, we have people that will come out and say the courts didn't do well. But one thing that I want us to look at is the future of our elections in the country moving forward. Now, when we even look at EU's presence in our country and in terms of monitoring elections now, I think it dates back to 2011 or thereabout, if I'm not mistaken. But when we look at this rebuttal from the presidency, what would you say will be the future of our elections moving forward? Now, in terms of one's support from the EU and in terms of monitoring as well.
So ultimately, I don't think the Nigerian government, as it stands, beyond all the saber rattling and noise making about how, oh, we're sovereign, EU doesn't have rights, blah blah blah. I don't think anything's going to fundamentally change about the relationship between the EU and the Nigerian government, for the simple fact that the EU brings money. So, and if you have any insight into how the Nigerian government operates, any kind of international institution that brings money is never turned away for whatever reason. It just doesn't happen. So yes, they might make a bit of noise. They might be saber rattling. Oh, you have no right to tell us this. We're independent. We're sovereign. Stop being neo-colonial. All those narratives. But at the end of the day, in another 4 years' time, EU will bring another 20 million euros. Are they going to turn it down? That's the question. The answer obviously would be no, they will not. So that relationship isn't going to change. The EU is still going to keep on being a strategic partner. And I think it would be better for everyone concerned if we just deal with that reality instead of wasting our time with statements that don't change the price of Gary in the market.
Yeah, okay, so let's also lean on that question Jan is just asked. Looking at the recommendations from the EU, they highlighted 6 particular areas. When you look into these 6 areas, do you think that when we come up the next 4 years of election, that we'll be seeing anything different? Of course, we looked at how the proceedings were, the place of women in our political system, how journalists were treated during the election. These are some of the 6 areas that EU says
voter intimidation.
Yeah, voter intimidation. These are areas that the EU says needs to be squarely upended before our next elections. What are your thoughts? Do you think that we can get these abysmally right before the next round of elections in Nigeria?
So that would depend on primarily what legal safeguards are put in place. So I mentioned earlier that the Electoral Amendment Act of 2022 didn't go far enough. I think there needs to be another Electoral Amendment Act.
Is it just the amendments or the interpretation
and implementation?
We have interpretation and implementation problem with that Electoral Act.
I agree there are definitely issues with implementation, but it always starts with the very legislation itself. So for example, what we were told according to the popular narrative last year was that the Electoral Amendment Act of 2022 allowed for something called electronic vote transmission. Now, as soon as you voted at the polling center on the day, that your votes be tabulated and transmitted to the IRF server. And from there, you'll be able to track the results live. In practice, as I came to find out fairly recently, the results that were announced were not in any way tied to what was uploaded to the IRF, even by law. So basically, INEC misled us intentionally. Right? So they came out and made statements that gave us the impression that it is the results on the IRF that are tabulated into the results that are announced. No. There was still the collation center, which was the middleman race that we thought we had cut out using electronic transmission. But no, there are still collation centers And magic still took place overnight at those collation centers. And according to the law that we thought was such a fantastic law, the only usefulness that the IREV had was that the EC20 form at the collation center, the total number of accredited voters on that form must match the total number of accredited voters on the EC8 form submitted via the IREV. So in other words, regardless of whatever mutilation happened on the sheets that we saw, people using TPEX, people canceling a zero here, all that stuff, none of that matters. All that matters is that the total number of registered voters at the bottom must tally, right? So essentially, the law that we thought we had, was not the law that we had. So from that very basic level, we had a set of expectations about how the election was going to run that were not based in actual reality. So I think the law itself needs to be overhauled first of all. Okay. Then, very rightly, you said that there are issues with interpretation and implementation. The interpretation issue, I think, can be solved with legislation as well. And what I mean by that is that in Nigeria, when you're writing a law, what you do not want to do under any circumstances is leave ambiguity in the law. You want to spell everything out in granular detail. So if you are giving INEC the power to do something, you have to state to what extent INEC has this power, who can wield it, what are the limits of this power, under what circumstances can it be wielded. That sort of everything has to be spelled out. Okay. I think that's how you deal with the interpretation issue. You basically spell even if the legislation has to reach 1,000 pages, it doesn't matter. Spell it out.
Okay. I think
and then obviously the implementation, that's where the devil is always in the implementation.
Thank you so much.
I don't think anyone has any control over that.
Thank you so much, David.